All right, everyone, welcome back to the Gentleman's Wrestling Podcast. I am Jesse Collings, your regular host. I'm here as always with Jason Ounpraseuth. Jason, how's it going?
It's going pretty well. A lot of exciting stuff recently in wrestling. Some other cringy sort of things, mostly just supernatural related, but it's easy to ignore that with all the other cool stuff going
What
on.
would wrestling be without its cringy stuff, though? I don't want to live in a world where there's not at least one super cringy thing happen. Well, cringy in certain ways. Obviously, like there are other aspects of cringy that we could do without, such as the speaking out stuff. But as far as product wise, it's always good to have just one shitty thing going on in wrestling from a creative standpoint.
I mean, what would wrestling Twitter be without all that stuff?
Exactly. If everything was just a 5-star match and money making angles, what would we do all day? We'd just be saying things are great. We'd be like, Ryan Satin. Just everything's awesome all of the time.
Yep.
Speaking of Ryan Satin and speaking of wrestling media in general, that is the theme of today's episode. It is us talking about the wrestling media landscape. And there's a couple things that kind of motivated me to do this episode. And it starts a few weeks ago. And there were two media calls. One was Triple H before NXT TakeOver. And then one was Tony Khan, I believe, before Double or Nothing. Was that when Tony Khan's last one was? About a month ago?
Yeah. Well, that was Cody Rhodes. He's usually on the pre-show.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It was Cody, not Tony. Tony does do media calls. He usually does,
The post-show ones.
Yeah, he does the post show, and he usually does like interviews with other media outlets. He does one with Figure Four, the Observer. But basically, that was kind of what predicated it, especially the Triple H one, because I feel like there was a lot of discussion about that. But in general, I'm fascinated by wrestling media and the kind of coverage that we have in wrestling media, what fans' expectations are for wrestling media. And it's something that's really intrigued me as someone that has participated in wrestling media for a while. And more importantly, someone, I don't want to like put myself over, but I always say I'm not a wrestling reporter. I have never claimed to be a reporter. I have never claimed in any of my writings or anything like that to be someone who reports things. I've always been like an opinion guy and analysis.
Mm-hmm.
In the real world, I'm an actual reporter. I have that in my Twitter profile. It says reporter in the real world. I work for newspapers. I work for USA Today. I work for Gannett Media. I'm in the office now, as we just kind of got back to the office here. But I want to say that, like, as we talk about this, I'm coming at this in a lot of ways as a perspective of somebody who works covering non-wrestling news, essentially. And Jason, I know yourself, you have a background in journalism as well. You work for, a wrestling media site, obviously, but, you have a journalism degree and you have a background in covering what would be considered like non-wrestling based news.
Yeah, for sure. I've been a sports editor in my school newspaper
Mm-hmm.
for about a year, writing for the school newspaper as well, and just learning from my journalism teachers who have had experience in real newspapers, and just sort of hearing stories about that, and just getting those teachings from there, learning AP style and all that other stuff. That's
Yeah,
my experience.
yeah, and that's important too, because as we get into this, I think one of the main things is kind of looking at professional wrestling media and comparing it to real sports and how real sports are covered, and just in general how the real world is covered. And there are some similarities between what the trends we're seeing in wrestling and the real world, but there are also some things that are kind of unique to professional wrestling. And I'll start by kind of looking at it like this way, and that's like briefly kind of looking at the history of wrestling media coverage. If you go back before, let's say, pre-2000s, you can go back and you can find like newspaper accounts of wrestling matches from 100 years ago.
Yep.
A lot of the time, if you go back and read those were actually just like written up by a promoter or someone with a promotion and put
Right.
into the newspaper. It's basically a press release. Um, with like results and, hyping up, oh, next week, Andre the Giant is going to be in Omaha and he's going to be wrestling, Killer Kowalski, whoever he is around. And that's what you would see. And there were, old magazines and stuff. Everything kept pretty much, kayfabe, right? We're not really breaking any new ground. In the 60s and 70s, you start seeing newsletters pop up. They have varying levels of legitimacy. I know Mike Tenay ran a newsletter in like the 60s when he was a teenager. That, like Dave Meltzer has said, was, kind of inspired him to do his newsletter. And then you got, the Apter magazines, Bill Apter, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, which kind of is still to this day kind of a kayfabe, publication. It's wrestling, but it's not what I would call like real functional reporting. It's kind of just like hyping up different aspects of wrestling and covering different aspects of wrestling, but it's not like, I don't want to say it's not real journalism, but it's kind of like PR. It's a weird thing for wrestling. It's like covering stuff in script, basically. But then you get to, the 80s and the 90s, you got, Wrestling Observer Newsletter with Dave Meltzer. You got Pro Wrestling Torch, with Wade Keller. A couple of others that come along that kind of really pull back the curtain and really try to cover wrestling from, with a background of real journalism. For all of the crap that Dave gets for his reporting, and there are pros and cons to that. I'm generally pro Dave, but there are definitely some things where I'm like, okay, Dave, why'd you report that? But anyone has that. That's a prominent reporter. But Dave has a real background in journalism. I think he went to San Jose State. He worked for newspapers. He worked as a sports reporter for years and years before doing the Observer full time. So he understands the tenements of journalism in wrestling. But when you get to the 90s, really, there still wasn't a huge demand for like what Dave Meltzer and Wade Keller and some others were doing. There wasn't a huge demand for like real what's going on behind the scenes kind of reporting.
Yep.
It was a group of loyal, hardcore fans that were super, super into wrestling and would subscribe to the newsletters and get all that information. In the 2000s, that really changes with the internet. Suddenly, a lot more people are into the backstage news. They're into, the reality of wrestling. They're into these stories about people refusing to job to other people. And there's just this huge surge in interest in what people want, more people wanting information from wrestling sites. And that has continued to grow since 2000. You look at, I know a lot of different people who run different websites have said publicly and or personally to me that, oh, this is the biggest. There's my manager. He's in the background. He's gonna be looking at me. But but a lot of them have said to me, like, oh yeah, this was our best year ever. 2018, most traffic on the site ever. 2019 was our biggest year, even though way less people are watching wrestling than they were in, say, 2000 or 1999. The demand is so huge now for real news and for real information. And I think that's kind of changed. And I think that's unique to pro wrestling in that demand has come of age solely during the internet age, in the information age, where it's all in the shadow of modern news and doesn't have a lot of traditional background. Like, for instance, baseball, right? By the time the internet rolled around, people who were fans of baseball had really specific expectations for baseball coverage because baseball had been covered seriously for over 100 years. Through newspapers, through magazines, through all sorts, radio, television, all this kind of stuff, baseball had a tradition of being covered. So when the internet hit, baseball coverage mirrored and was held to the same standard as previous eras. With wrestling, it was kind of like new ground. It kind of only came of age during the internet period. And what I think that has happened, what has happened from that is that it kind of takes only, a lot of wrestling media only exists in, in the podcasting forum or in YouTube videos or in people with blogs. And it's a very different standard to me And I think that's led to a lot of confusion and debate about what proper wrestling coverage is and what do fans expect from wrestling coverage. Does that make any sense? That was kind of a ramble on my end, but what'd you get out of that?
Yeah, for sure. It makes a lot of sense. Obviously, like the way wrestling is covered is different than other sports. You don't write a game story from a wrestling event. You don't have access to the wrestlers
Mm-hmm.
as sort of really as you do in traditional sports. Like after say like the Suns Clippers game, you get access to Chris Paul after a game. After a Raw, you don't get to interview Drew McIntyre after. It's just kind of moving on to the next show, and that's pretty unique in that aspect. And I guess that just sort of depends on whether you view it as sort of a more like a TV movie medium where like, oh, you just watch this movie and then you just write your review after. And that's sort of like, what you do in wrestling media as well. You just write your opinion of a wrestling show similar to you would do a movie review, not really a game story as you would. But at the same time, we see the rise of obviously these journalists have been around, but thanks to the internet, like Woj and Adam Schefter, their tweets of signings really get a lot of traction. And we see the same with wrestling media
Mm-hmm.
as well. The biggest stories are the ones that, oh, Aleister Black might sign with AEW. Oh, WWE reportedly wants Aleister Black, back in WWE. Those are the biggest news stories. But obviously, you get interesting pushback from the talent themselves, more so than I guess it gets covered in the NFL, so to speak. With someone like, let's say, like Kirk Cousins, he's like, oh, you hear a report of like, oh, Kirk Cousins, he wants out of Minnesota, and you don't really hear Kirk Cousins backlashing against that report. But if, let's say, a Dave Meltzer or Sean Ross Sapp report that, oh, so and so isn't happy at WWE, and then that person might right away say, oh, that's not true. Oh, you don't know what you're talking about. And whether it sometimes, half the time it does end up being true. Like, oh, that person really wasn't happy. They confirm it on a podcast of these stories of like, oh, yeah, I wasn't happy. I pitched all these ideas. But then, at the same time, it's like, oh, well, someone else reported that, but you don't really give them that credit. It's a very weird dynamic between the talent and the media compared to like other sports. Obviously there's backlash in other sports, but it's very different in wrestling.
Yeah, I mean, that's a real key distinction here is access and sources, right?
Mhm.
There's kind of there's different variations of wrestling media. I would say there are what I would call three kind of boxes where you can look at wrestling media. The first is a fairly small amount of real wrestling reporters and wrestling insiders that have a lot of sources inside and report stories that more often than not are accurate. Dave Meltzer being probably the most well known, but like you said, Sean Ross Sapp over at Fightful, Wade Keller over at the Pro Wrestling Torch, the guys at PWI Insider. You'll see them; they pop up. They're kind of everywhere because you have those people, and those are what I would consider like the real wrestling reporters. At the second kind of box, you have the aggregators, right?
Mm-hmm.
These are the different websites that kind of find all the information that is being reported from these different people and then putting them in one spot. Wrestling Inc., the site that both you and I are affiliated with, is one of those. They will occasionally break a big news story because you're not around. The site's been around for 25 plus years. It's you're not going to be around without having some sources. But for the most part, it's an aggregator finding all the information and putting it together so people can find it all in one place. And then the third box, you have what I would call like non-news sources. These are podcasts and opinion-based blogs and such, or Twitter accounts that might occasionally break a story, but for the most part are people just giving their opinion on different issues and ideas, or just repeating stuff that isn't really like news. Like, oh, WWE is going to be holding Money in the Bank, on this date. And it's like, well, we know that because they said that on Raw.
Yeah.
Roman Reigns is going to face Rey Mysterio tonight in Hell in a Cell. I'm like, yeah, well, that's on social media. But those are kind of like the three different levels of it. And I think what the reason we have all that is because of this lack of sources and the inability to have access to people who were willing to go on the record and talk about things. Like you compared it to the Suns-Clippers game, right? A basketball game. If you want to talk to Chris Paul, well, Chris Paul has to give a media interview after the game at a press conference in a playoff game. They're contractually obligated through the players' union's collective bargaining agreement that they have to give those things. They have to talk to them. Same thing with the coach interviews that are usually worthless. The coaches legally have to give those, like, before the third quarter, I caught up with Mike Boldenholzer. Mike Boldenholzer, why can't you guys stop Trae Young? Like, I don't know, he's really good. We just got to play harder defense. That stuff that's contractually obligated. Even more so, the media goes to shoot-arounds. The media goes to practices. The media shows up 2 hours before games and talks to the players sitting around. The media can go into the locker room after games and talk to people. It's a much more open environment in real sports than what you have in pro wrestling, which is you have, these media calls, which we'll get to, but are like one of the only times that independent members of the media are permitted to ask questions for active talent or executives. And it creates this dynamic where you're really relying on someone like Dave Meltzer, who has years and years of cold sources within different companies to get information, for us to know really anything about it. Because even to this day, the media environment around wrestling is so closed, and they don't let you talk to people, and they don't let you, talent isn't allowed to talk to reporters they're not supposed to talk to. And that has its own problem, because even though people like Dave Meltzer and Wade Keller have these sources, and Sean Ross Sapp too, they're almost never credited. They're always anonymous sources. It's always like, oh, someone in WWE told me that, there's a report. The feeling backstage is that they're really worried about the people who got released. Like, there's no one ever going on the record being like, oh, I have this quote from, Cesaro, who's like, I can't believe Braun Strowman got released. That was really shocking by me. I feel bad for him. That's like never on the record quote. It's always like people backstage are a little upset that Braun Strowman got released.
Right.
And that's a totally different environment. I mean, other real sports people do use sources that they don't name all the time too. But if you're going to be like writing stuff down and getting information, you usually get written down sources. I personally, in the field that I'm in, I really never use anonymous sources. Just the kind of, local journalism that I'm doing, it's really not worth using anonymous sources. I always say, if you've got something to tell me that you think is important, you can go on the record and say it. Otherwise, I'm not going to use it. But that's also because I'm in the real world and not in this wacky world of professional wrestling where you're just, by tradition, not supposed to talk to the media and not supposed to, go on the record about anything. And it creates a weird dynamic.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you said earlier, this rise of media has come pretty recently for the most part compared to, traditional media. And for a long time in wrestling, it's about keeping kayfabe. It's about, preserving this figments of imaginary sort of a sanctity of wrestling. You gotta keep it pure, very unpure environments. But yeah, with all that being said, like you said, there's a lot of anonymous sources being used, and even then, there's agendas backstage, of whatever these sources have, and even when wrestlers do come on speak with any sort of wrestling media outlet, there's definitely an angle there of whatever they want to promote. With after a post release, a lot of these wrestlers will do interviews. Because they want to get their name out there. They want to make sure, hey, I exist. I've been sitting around for so long, and I need to get my name out there. I need to get my story out there, because that's what they have to do. And there's always some type of angle, some type of motivation for a lot of these interviews that are out there. And even then, wrestlers, they have their own podcasts now, so they can tell their own stories themselves, and then that gets aggregated, into the wrestling news atmosphere itself. And so that just so many ways that wrestlers themselves can sort of form their own sort of stories for themselves.
Yeah, and there's this whole other dynamic where if you're, relying on inside sources for your livelihood, if your site is based around or your newsletter is based around these anonymous sources and you got a few people that tell you things, when it comes to, ethically, when it comes to maybe reporting some things that might look negative for those sources, that causes a problem because you're like, well, do I want to report this story that's going to make this guy look bad because that guy is actually a big source for me and I don't want him to stop feeding me information, so maybe I won't report that story. I'm not saying there's an incident that I know of specifically where that happened, but as a journalist, that's a real ethical question you have to deal with, which is I'm really reliant on this person to get me information. I don't want to piss them off and I don't want them to feel like they can't tell me anything because then I'm out of a job and no one's going to, read my things if I don't have sources. It's something that anyone in journalism deals with on a regular basis. It's just the part of the job, and it becomes harder when there's only a few people kind of reporting on something because it ends up being more difficult on that end. And that kind of brings me to these media calls. Well, first, let me talk about. Actually, I want to talk about like the amount of people who like pretend. I don't want to say they pretend that they're reporters, but I do think that there's a contingent of people all over social media, all over YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, that fancy themselves wrestling reporters and consider themselves like, oh yeah, I'm a wrestling insider, I do this. But all they do is either give their opinions about things or do softball interviews with people. And to me, that's not being a reporter. That's not real journalism practice. It's something different.
Yeah.
It happens a lot. I'll give. This is the Ryan Satin problem. And what I mean by that is that a few weeks ago, when Showbuzz Daily, R.I.P. Showbuzz Daily, went down, and they weren't coming back, which made it so we didn't have the same kind of immediate ratings information that we had become accustomed to getting for the Tuesday after Raw and the Thursday at 4:00 drop. The most exciting part of the wrestling week would be Thursday at 4:00 Eastern time when the Showbuzz Daily would upload the ratings for Dynamite and NXT. When that went away, and Ryan Satin, who's allegedly a wrestling reporter and a member of the wrestling media, was like, "Oh boy, I'm so glad that we don't have to talk about ratings anymore, and we can just talk about storylines and angles and that kind of thing." And to me, that's really anti-ethical to what your job should be as a wrestling reporter, which should be celebrating the fact that we had factual information and statistics, that we were getting accurately from Showbuzz Daily and quickly. And you shouldn't be celebrating that the public can no longer have access to that information as easily. It would be kind of like being a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and then being like, "Oh, I'm so glad the Dow Jones is no longer being reported. So now we don't have any idea what how the stocks are doing. And I think that's a lot better for us." It's like, no, you shouldn't be celebrating that. But what that idea comes from is not because you're a wrestling reporter, but because you're an analyst and because you're giving your opinions on things. And you do not want to muddy up your opinion-based content with factual evidence, right?
Yeah.
Because I can say an opinion, like a dumb one, like, you know what? I think Roman Reigns is the biggest drawing WWE wrestler in the history of WWE. Let's say that's my opinion, right? Oh, well, that's my opinion. You guys can't really disprove that. Well, you can look at, oh, well, actually, Jesse, I have these TV ratings that show that, Roman Reigns, was not a star drawing the same kind of TV numbers as, Steve Austin, for example. And I could say, well, looks like my opinion looks pretty faulty because you have this factual evidence to contradict my opinion. And now I look kind of foolish. That's an extreme example. I don't think anyone's making that case for Roman Reigns, but if you're Ryan Satin and you're just kind of giving your opinions on stuff, and people are like, well, Ryan, I think that's wrong because, look, I have this factual information, it makes you look bad. And I think there's a defensiveness towards wanting to exist in an environment where everyone is just kind of giving their opinions and nobody can be proven to be right or wrong. And that happens a lot in the dynamics of wrestling because wrestling is not a real sport. You know, there's not a lot of factual evidence you can use to argue against a point. Like, I think the Alexa Bliss stuff is horrible, as you know, we touched on earlier. But someone can say, oh, well, I actually think the Alexa Bliss stuff is great. And what kind of factual evidence do we have to really support each of our positions? There's not a lot. We could look at ratings, but the ratings kind of stay the same every week for the most part. It mostly just comes down to, well, we have two different opinions about what is good and what is bad. And I think that's kind of what happens in wrestling discussions a lot. You know, wrestling is an art form. It exists to be debated, and there's very few times where you can say something was truly right and something was truly wrong. And the only thing we have is like things like television ratings and live attendance and different kind of barometers for success that we can use arbitrarily to back up our arguments. And without that, with less access to that, we're just kind of a bunch of people giving our opinions, and no one can prove that I'm wrong because there's no factual evidence to say that I'm wrong. And I just think that's kind of, in general, what the media atmosphere seems to be like in wrestling.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you said, wrestling is not a real sport. You know, you can't say, oh, Roman Reigns has like 10 more wins than Steve Austin. It's like, that doesn't really matter. You know, it's not like comparing, oh, Dak Prescott to like, whatever, like Justin Herbert in their rookie years. Like, oh, Dak Prescott had 2 more wins. Like, okay, that actually means something in that example. It's more like movies, you know? It's like, oh, this movie industry, we're not going to report box office numbers anymore. And it's like, well, how are you going to compare movies then? Like critic scores, I guess, but it's still an opinion there. You know, box office scores, you know, obviously some good movies don't do well in the box office, but there's still more factual based evidence to support why a movie doesn't do well in the box office or not. You know, that's just more comparable there than to say, oh, Roman Reigns, he has spear as the better spear than Goldberg because he used the spear more to win matches. It's like, that's just more booking things. That's not really a factual type of thing there in wrestling. So yeah, it's just one unique part of wrestling compared to, yeah, like you said, real sport.
Yeah, I mean, in real sports, you have statistics and stuff. Like, you and I could have an opinion. Like, me and you could have a debate. I'd be like, Jason, who do you think the best wrestler in the world is? And you think it's Kazuchika Okada, and I think it's Kenny Omega. We can have a debate about it, and like none of us are going to really be able to prove who's right or wrong because it's just such an opinion-based thing. There's not enough facts to support that. If we were to have a debate like, Jason, who do you think the best center in the NBA is? And you think it's Joel Embiid, and I think it's Nikola Jokic. We can be like, we have all sorts of stats. We have the results of games. It's a sport, so we have all that information. In wrestling, we don't have that. And I think that all comes back and boils up to the general wrestling media environment where a lot of people think that people reviewing Raw are members of the media. They're not. They're people that review Raw. They're critics, but they're not doing real reporting. They're not doing real journalism. And I think there is an unfortunate kind of amount of hostility towards real reporting and real facts. And I think that comes back to the environment that the current wrestling media landscape came of age in, which was in the age of the internet, in the age of cable news. If you watch any cable news, it literally does not matter what network it is. Watch any cable news, and what you'll see is on the news program, you'll see 1 minute of a news story. Like they'll say, Joe Biden is signing this new law about immigration into Congress, right?
Yeah.
That will be and they'll talk about what's in the law for 60 seconds. And that will be followed by 59 minutes of various people giving their opinions on what they think about the law. They're not really reporting. They're just kind of analyzing and giving their opinions on it. That seems to be so much of what people expect out of wrestling media to be, which is we're going to have this news show, but we're going to talk about, let's talk about, AEW Dynamite, it did, 855,000 viewers, 0.27 in 18 to 49. And then we'll talk about that, and then we'll spend 59 minutes talking about why we liked or did not like Dynamite and analyze Dynamite. What do we think going on is Dynamite? Mm-hmm. It's analysis. It's not real news reporting. And I think people almost media literacy in the general public is very low.
Yep.
So people think that that's real reporting. They think when they watch, whether it's Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, it really doesn't matter. When they watch that, they're watching the news when they're really watching people have opinions about the news. And I feel like that's similar to wrestling. And it's because there's not that long traditional background of wrestling media. Wrestling media almost solely exists in the age of the internet and the age of cable news. And that's the kind of environment we have, which is mostly talking heads blabbing about their opinions on different aspects of pro wrestling. Which, by the way, is what we're doing right now. I'm not losing the irony. I want to let everyone know. Yes. I'm not losing the irony in all that. I understand that this is not a show based around reporting stuff. But we never claimed to be. Like I said, I never claimed to be a wrestling reporter.
Yep, same.
Never in my life have I said, I have some people, but I don't have a bunch of sources. I'm not, I've got a Patreon page where I drop scoops and stuff like that. I'm literally a guy who likes talking about wrestling, but I've never claimed to be that. But there are some people who basically do what you and I are doing, Jason, and think that they're big members of the wrestling media and that they're, real reporters. And I'm sorry, that's not the case if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, same here. I just consider myself a writer. That's because it's literally what I do. I write, but I'm a wrestling writer. So yes. I never consider myself like a reporter or anything like that.
But you're more than me. You do more than me as far as you'll listen to stuff and recap it.
Sure.
Which is, real reporting. That is part of it. I don't even do that stuff. I literally just give my opinions on stuff.
Yeah, but I guess continue on your point, with how wrestling is sort of part of the modern mediascape, fans so much more are more connected to their favorite wrestlers, more so than, I guess, people who feel connected to Tom Brady. Tom Brady probably isn't really interacting with you on social media. You have a better chance of a Drew McIntyre or a Ricky Starks interacting with you on social media, so more so than a Tom Brady or Patrick Mahomes. And so I think because of that, I think maybe fans feel a connection towards those wrestlers. And I guess if someone reports something bad about those wrestlers, then they feel defensive about that. And I think that's where that negative reaction comes from. I see it a bunch of times on Sean Ross Sapp's Twitter. He's interacting with a lot of people who have backlash to his reporting or whatever. And, he's defending himself as, hey, this is real news. I'm not making things up. I actually have sources. That's what he's saying. And, I believe him on that. But for fans, they feel very defensive about that. They have to protect their favorite wrestler.
They got it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. They have to protect their safety. They have to protect their innocence, even though they probably don't really care about what other fans have to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, that's right, and that's kind of getting back to my point. Is there's this hostility towards factual information that really exists in politics, as we saw over the last 4 years when it comes to facts and people bringing up stuff that may paint people in a bad light and people reacting negatively to that, people saying they're making it up. Look, Dave Meltzer will just say I'll say Brian Alvarez will literally just post the AEW Dynamite viewership and the NXT viewership and what they did in the demo, and people all over him on social media. Oh, you're so biased, blah, 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 blah. You hate WWE, all stuff like that. And it's he's literally just posting the numbers. That's it. There's not a shred of opinion-based content in that at all. It's literally just the factual information. And people get mad about it because people are so entrenched in their opinions that they don't want to hear this information that contradicts their opinions. And I mean, that's weird to me, at least, because if I'm wrong about something, I'll be we've talked about this before. It's the same thing with, learning about wrestling that we haven't watched before. I enjoy, this Joshi match was really good. Let me watch it. I hope it's really good. And some people react negatively to that kind of stuff. But it's an entire, social environment. It goes beyond wrestling. But I think it's particularly pronounced in wrestling because of the, as I got into the history of how it was reported and this sudden surge of interest in behind-the-scenes news, along with what has always been a very contentious, partisan fan base.
Yeah, for sure. And that gets even more interesting when you get into things that are more forward, like in the media calls. I think we could turn
Yeah.
into that of mostly WWE. I mean, AEW has been doing them. It's mostly been Cody since he is an executive vice president. He's been doing them, but I think most of what we're going to say comes from the more NXT media calls more so than AEW ones.
Well, I feel two separate kind of aspects to it. I'm generally pretty disappointed when I listen to the media calls. You listen to the media calls live?
No, I just follow them on Twitter live.
Okay. I have before. I don't always, but I'm always fairly disappointed in the media calls, especially the Triple H ones. It has nothing to do with WWE in this aspect, but it does have to do with the people who ask questions and like the questions that they ask. And like, it's like, we have basically no opportunity to talk to, Triple H doesn't face the media in that kind of setting. He might do an interview or a feature story with a mainstream publication where he's one-on-one, but we very rarely have the opportunity to hear these wrestlers interviewed by a multiple amounts of journalists in a live setting. And a lot of the questions are really disappointing. They're kayfabe-based questions. They're just like, they're not even like, I wouldn't even call them softball questions. They'll be like, how great is Johnny Gargano? And Triple H would be like, yeah, that's great. Like it's not like, it's like just these like basic questions by people. Like there's so much you could ask Triple H. And Dave Meltzer basically asked Triple H, what is it like when seeing some of the NXT call-ups, not do particularly well on the main roster? Is that seen as problematic? And then that's like a real question that I would like to ask Triple H, and I'm glad Dave asked it. And then Triple H gave this long rambling response where he low-key buried like a bunch of people. He said sometimes it's the coaches, sometimes it's the players. They don't know how to get it together. He compared it to college players flopping in the NFL and said sometimes it doesn't work out because the players suck, or which the players in this case would be the wrestlers, or the coaches suck, which the coaches in this case would be Vince. But that's like almost a rarity on these NXT calls, is the calling on, and there should be more people involved asking hard questions, but also like good questions. I think that there is a kind of like a disconnect in the media. People seem to think that if you ask someone a good question, it has to be like a gotcha question or a hard question.
Right.
Like people want you to ask, like Dave's question, for example, where he basically pointed out that people in NXT, haven't always done well when they go up to the main roster. That's not a gotcha question. Triple H's response, his rambling response where he kind of buried everyone, that was very indicative of, he didn't really want to answer that question. And he also, let me rephrase that. If Triple H felt really earnestly that the NXT system was great, and when they get called up to the main roster, that's great too, and everything is perfect, and they got a 6-month plan for everyone when they get called up, or whatever he said in the past about the process of people getting called up to the main roster. If he felt really truly confident in all that, he wouldn't have given a rambling answer where he buried everyone. He would have said something where he had a lot more confidence and a lot more direct purpose, or he should have said that if he truly felt that way. If you truly feel that your system is great, you can have no problem elaborating on why you think that system is great.
Right.
If you don't think it's great, you're going to maybe kind of give a rambling answer where you don't really answer the question. And so like Dave's question is a good question. It's not a gotcha question. It's only a gotcha question because Triple H couldn't answer it appropriately, which was telling. It's the same thing. When I interview people for my job, you always have to think, okay, what kind of questions can I ask that aren't just the most basic questions that everyone asks these people? Especially when it's if it's someone who gets interviewed a lot, if it's a celebrity or, a public official or someone, you can't just ask them all basic generic questions. You want to come up with a good question for them to ask. And a lot of the times, the sources or the people you're interviewing are not like it when you ask them a question that they're not always asked. I think there are questions you can ask Triple H where he'd really appreciate you asking a question, about something, specific to NXT talent development. That's not like, oh, like, how come you guys, took so long to fire Velveteen Dream? Like, he's obviously not going to like that question, and that's definitely a gotcha question.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say that doesn't deserve to be asked, because it certainly does. But overall, it's an interesting dynamic to me, seeing kind of the attention that's played on those media calls.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it's kind of a weird part as well, because usually people aren't writing a full article on these media calls, unlike like back when I was I was a sports reporter for my college newspaper. You have these post game interviews, and yeah, that would be a big part of your article after. That'd be a big way to fill up your words, and so you had to ask good questions to get the coach to really speak about a game. You switched out this player here in this instance. What happened there? Oh, what happened with this defense? But for these media calls, it's usually just people picking out different parts of that media call and getting an article out of that. It's not really just someone writing a full article on the whole media call, because, like you said, a lot of the questions being asked are just more kayfabe questions that don't really deserve any media attention at all. And so, like you said, there could be more questions being asked about NXT developments, what's being done to really help out, these Parker Bordeaux's and all these other people, like how can you develop them into big stars, especially someone being new in wrestling and all these other things, other than just like, oh, is this person going to move up to the main roster? It's like, like I always get asked, usually post game interviews, not really before the takeover, but after the takeover, someone loses and someone inevitably always asks, oh, is this person going to be moving up to the main roster? And now recently Triple H has sort of pushed back on those questions, saying like, oh, just because someone loses doesn't mean they're always going to be in the roster. You guys always ask this. And, it's just sort of a frequent question that seems to be always asked recently.
Yeah, and you could tell, at least in the Triple H one, that he was getting annoyed with some of the questions, which to me is good. Like, he shouldn't feel like he's with a bunch of buddies. He should feel like he's with a bunch of reporters who are asking inquisitive questions.
Yeah.
On the Cody media call, similar but kind of different. My problem with that one was that, like, Cody was calling on like children and stuff to ask him questions. Like, and it's one thing if it's like one person, but then it's like these people who are just like, they're just starting out. They don't really know what they're doing. I'll play it lightly. I'll bury Louis Dagnor because why not? But like, these are people who are just starting out in their journalism career. They're, it's good that they're on this platform, but they're not going to be serious reporters. And as, if I'm a serious reporter, I'm mad that Cody he can take 8 questions or whatever. He's wasting half of them on children, like literal children,
Yep.
and not, asking, not calling on your Sean Ross Sapp, or not calling on your Nick Housemans, and not calling on your, Dave Meltzers or whatever. And I don't know who did get called and who not. I just named some people who ask actual good questions. And I'd be mad, like, okay, we're wasting my time and all of our times with this really good opportunity. You get a chance to ask a wrestling media executive on a media call, and I've got these children ask me questions. These people who are not real members of wrestling media. They're not real reporters. They're people who, run a little Twitter account or run a YouTube vlog, and that's good for them. But this is I'd like it to be held to a standard of, this is a serious media environment. We need serious media people with real backgrounds, with real credentials, with real experience involved. We don't want to have just all of these, I don't want to call them marks because that's a dumb term, but all of these people who are just going to kind of ask kayfabe questions and basically just fans with blogs, and not people who are really interested in truly covering the business. And that was my problem with the Cody call. It wasn't necessarily about like people just asking stupid. It wasn't directly about people asking stupid questions. It more seemed to be about what the tone we were going for here, which was, make sure to ask, like, the kind of like just having the kids on made me like feel like you're kind of like mocking the whole practice.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I think sometimes fans can't forget that, like, hey, Cody, the Bucks, and Kenny, they're actual executives of the company.
Yes, they're not your friends.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a kayfabe thing either. It's not just like, oh, they're just playing characters as executives. Like, they actually are executives, and it'd be informative to ask Cody about the questions he does as an executive. Oh, what's it like getting, talk about sponsors and getting all that stuff, how to put a show together. I know I don't know if he still does, but I think before he was doing Gorilla on Dark. Ask him about that experience and, like, oh, what do you look for? And when you sign people from Dark to AEW, those are really informative questions from an executive perspective. But I think on that call, I think that was before, that was before Double or Nothing. A lot of people kept asking him about his particular match with Anthony Ogogo.
Yeah, it's like, who cares?
Yeah, exactly. Because we don't really care, because he's not really there just as a wrestler. He's there as an executive.
Yes,
that's why he's on the call.
You're interviewing an executive vice president of the second largest wrestling company in America, a company that's doing all sorts of different things, making all sorts of different moves, and you're asking him about oh, do you think you're gonna have a good match with Anthony Ogogo? Like what's Cody gonna say? No. It's like, and this gets with good Lord, Tony Khan, the man cannot open his mouth without aggregators and everyone just rushing to report whatever he said, and then just triggering all these people off. Like this, even this week, Tony Khan says, WCW was really disorganized, and Vince Russo made it worse. Anyone that has ever paid attention to wrestling history knows that that's the case, and there's a million people, backstage talent and wrestlers who will go on and say, yeah, WCW was really disorganized. But because Tony Khan said it, and he's this boogeyman for certain people, it's suddenly like, oh, well, how does Tony Khan say that? WCW was drawing 2.5 million viewers, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, that's the kind of stuff I don't like. And that's the kind of stuff I don't like with the aggregators, where just like any time a wrestler says something, it's like, that's a news story. And it doesn't create a really strong environment when that's, what's being marketed, where every time Tony Khan opens his mouth, people are overreacting and creating kind of a negative environment along with that. Somewhat kind of related to the media calls. So I think there's a prevailing belief on the media calls that on both ends, that if you ask a really hard question or you kind of, push the people you're going to interview on, you're not going to be asked back, because that is, and that is something that is, again, all about that kind of access and not making your sources mad. Instead, if you want to be on the call, don't piss us off. Mm-hmm. And I know, and you do, I know we've talked about this with this person before, but someone we know asked some difficult questions on a press call last time, and they were not asked, they were not put back on the press call the next time. And, that's kind of the reality of it. And that kind of gets back into, again, the closed circuit environment. If you are a sports reporter and you are covering the Phoenix Suns, and, you do a story where you make someone on the Suns look bad, or you ask questions about, a coaching decision or something like that, it's not going to be like the Suns are going to be like, you know what, you're not invited back. We're not letting you into the building. We're not letting you talk to any of these people. It doesn't work like that. Even if you're a muckraker, and if you are, doing some digging and you're doing a story that maybe doesn't make everyone look good, you're still welcomed back and you still are allowed to do your job. They don't deny you access to press conferences. You're not, kicked out. And I think in that instance, the public and the fan base should be mad about WWE not letting people that ask them hard questions into these press calls. Because who cares if they're going to do that with everybody? What's the point of the press call if all they're just going to get is softball questions? Exactly. And I think WWE wants it to all be softball questions. They don't. They want to have this idea that they're this open-minded company that's friendly with the media, but they don't want to pay any of the price for being that open to the media by having negative media coverage. They want to control it. And I think that's damaging. I think WWE really, really craves mainstream media attention.
Yes.
They want articles to be written about them. But the problem with that on that end is that so often the articles being written, whether it's Yahoo, I'll tell you, the Yahoo story is a good one. So about a week ago, there was a story on Yahoo's finance page about WWE ticket sales being really good.
Right.
And Stephanie McMahon's quoted, and she's saying, our ticket sales are great. Our fan bases are so loyal. If you follow any of the actual wrestling reporters, the belief is that ticket sales are really poor for WWE. I mean, SummerSlam tickets are moving well. Money in the Bank tickets are moving well. But a lot of these Raws and these SmackDowns and these house shows, the tickets are really disappointing. And AEW is outdrawing WWE in some markets. And, of course, Yahoo just takes Stephanie McMahon at her word and runs the headline and says, WWE ticket sales soaring. And it's like, that's what happens with a lot of the mainstream media outlets, is that people who don't have any familiarity with wrestling are reporting on it. But more important than that is people who don't have any familiarity with wrestling and are reporting on it don't seem to take the time to care to get it right. Some people do.
Yeah.
Some people definitely do. But, as a reporter in the real world, you are always reporting on you don't need to be an expert to report on something. I'm always reporting. I like to think I'm a good reporter. I'm always reporting on stuff that I'm not an expert on. I'm not an expert on, planning developments. I'm not an expert on public health. I had to learn a lot about public health over the last 18 months for sure.
Yep.
But, I'm not an expert on any of those things. But you interview people, you take the time to make sure that the information you're giving out is accurate. And I think a lot of the times, like with that Yahoo story, the people aren't taking the time because they don't care, because it's pro wrestling and pro wrestling is fake. Therefore, it doesn't really matter if my story has fake information in it. I think that's generally what it cuts down to. Who cares if Stephanie McMahon is lying about the ticket sales or she's painting it in a more positive light than it really is? It's pro wrestling. It's fake. Everyone knows it's fake. Who cares if the numbers are fake? I think that's a general approach to it.
Yeah, I mean, just going back a couple points with WWE controlling the media calls, I think a big part of that is solidarity within just everyone else within media. I remember, I believe it was Royce Young and Russell Westbrook back when there was Oklahoma City. They had a big back and forth. Just Russell Westbrook didn't really like Royce Young's framing of his. I think it was with Kevin Durant. Back then, just the whole locker room atmosphere. But there's solidarity with Royce Young. All the other NBA reporters, they were very supportive of Royce Young. They supported his reporting of the team itself, and so that really helped him out to make sure that he got a fair shake with Russell Westbrook, whether they like each other or not, just as long as they have respect and there's solidarity within the media to make sure that he gets to do his job correctly. And with other wrestling media, like you said, there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of sort of questionable people, well, not questionable people, just questions of whether actual reporters or not, or just people giving out their opinions, or just analysts, quote unquote, as well. And touching on the mainstream media points, you hear that with podcasts as well. With the big mans themselves, they're not going to go on a podcast and expect very serious questions. Like with Stephanie McMahon, she'll go on Bill Simmons' podcast because she knows Bill Simmons isn't really going to ask any sort of deep questions. At most he asked was like AEW, like that sort of question. That was probably the most pressing question, which really wasn't really a pressing question.
And then there's no follow-up question to it, right? That's a big thing about having like you said, solidarity is if an act, this is one of the things that happened, which was on the NXT call, someone said, what happened to Velveteen Dream? And Triple H said, oh, we went to investigation and we found nothing. Someone asked a follow-up question. Oh, but the person who said they made it, the person who accused Velveteen Dream says they weren't contacted by WWE as part of the investigation. Like, what do you have to say about that? A very difficult follow-up question that you can only do if you're a serious reporter and you're watching what's happening and you understand to ask a follow-up question. And that sometimes you have to abandon your canned, hey, what do you think about the ladder match later? That's going to happen tomorrow question, and instead ask a real follow-up question to that. And then Triple H, said, we stand by our investigation. He kind of had no response to it, which again was telling. Kind of noticing when you say no comment, it kind of tells you a little bit more about the situation. And that's, like you said, solidarity, working together. And the wrestling media doesn't always do that. And you have the people, like Ryan Satin, who hate Dave Meltzer and are going to be, and I'm not saying you have to like everyone in the wrestling media, or you even have to respect any of their work, because there are certain people I don't, or whose work I don't respect. I've said it in the last hour on this podcast. But you can't be. You're right. There has to be some form of standard. I think everyone needs to hold them to. And with the mainstream media, look, WWE skates on a lot of stuff that other companies, other major sports organizations would get killed over.
Yeah.
They got a little bit in the Saudi Arabia stuff. And that was a bad look for the company. And that was a good day for mainstream media's coverage of wrestling, because some places like, John Oliver and such, they really went there. But even like things like, compare over the last year, UFC running all of these shows during the pandemic with fighters testing positive, and there was a ton of media coverage over, UFC, are they ethical? Should they be having these fights? But it was a big mainstream kind of story. It was about UFC continuing to plow ahead on these shows during the middle of the pandemic. WWE was doing, and AEW were doing the same exact thing. And WWE had huge outbreaks of COVID, and we almost got nothing from the mainstream media.
Yep.
And again, I think that goes back to, it's fake, it's WWE. It doesn't really matter what's happening here. I do want to point out one thing that's funny. This is more humorous. The mainstream media's the history of the mainstream media writing a story on wrestling and just ham-fisting in a bunch of generic wrestling references.
Right.
So a few weeks ago, I think like a week or two ago, there was, I think, a Forbes article on AEW, a big profile on kind of Tony Khan and stuff like that. And it delivered us such gems as when referencing the Tony Khan Impact videos. They were called "More Tongue-in-Cheek Than Pile Driver." We also got Tony Khan would be crushing McMahon with a metaphorical steel chair. And we also got Tony Khan would rather recreate the heyday of the Monday Night Wars than have a sleeper hold on wrestling as McMahon has had. They just ham-fist all these wrestling terms into the story. I guess that's what they're trying to be cute. I don't know. It feels like me. They're always speaking down to wrestling fans who are considered to be very dumb. And to be fair, wrestling fans are very dumb.
Maybe that's part of that. You have like Joey Janela recently, just making a mockery of a school board, which deservedly deserves to be mocked because they're anti-mask board, but still, wrestlers doing dumb things is what you really see a lot in media, and so I that reflects what mainstream media thinks about wrestling as well. Wrestling
good, yeah. And I think just in general, the general scope of wrestling being fake has hurt its mainstream media scrutiny to a degree, because if you're doing something fake, then a lot of it is deemed to not matter, and that's stupid because the industry is real. It's real people. It's real stories being, unfolding backstage. That's what we're reporting on, the real aspects of wrestling, not the kayfabe aspects of wrestling. But I do think that there's general sentiment to just not try as hard when you're covering wrestling if you're working for a mainstream news outlet, and not make sure you're getting things right. And I think that ends up not being very good. And I think WWE, like I said, skates on a lot of these issues. They skate on a lot of things that would be scandals that would ruin anyone else. Doesn't affect WWE in the same way. The Chris Benoit scenario, incident, that definitely hurt WWE. But that's kind of in the steroid trial in the early 90s. But that's pretty much it. They skated on a lot of other stuff that would be considered pretty bad. But it's all very interesting. The one big takeaway I have is that I'm kind of pessimistic about things getting better, because I don't think fans ultimately hold wrestling media accountable enough and hold it to a standard that it needs to be for the industry to improve on pretty much every factor. I think we're continuing to devolve into this opinion-based content being just a wide majority of it, and for people to dismiss factual reporting and more people to get upset about factual reporting and, trying to discredit the media and trying to discredit people like Dave Meltzer. And I think I I don't see it getting any better. I think media literacy is going down as a whole in the country, and I don't see wrestling, following suit. And I'm kind of pessimistic about it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I haven't seen like the latest numbers on like whatever surveys have been done for media literacy, but like some ones I've seen before aren't really that good. Just people understanding the media and all that such there. And even then, and like, I think we touched on it before, but I think the big part is resources. There's not many investigative reporters in wrestling media, and I think that's a big part of why WWE especially can get away with all of these scandals. Obviously the big one, the big overarching one is like wrestlers are still independent contractors rather than especially mostly WWE wrestlers. I don't know, like obviously indie wrestlers are a different thing, but mostly WWE wrestlers are still independent contractors. And not all of wrestling media places have the resources for an investigative reporter to really dig deep into all that.
No, none of them do. I mean, there's a really good column that John Pollock over at Post Wrestling,
yes,
who's another like real wrestling reporter person that we should mention. He wrote a really good column about it was a year after Speaking Out, and he kind of talked about the wrestling media landscape and kind of what caused Speaking Out to happen and the ramifications for that. And his general point was that there aren't enough serious wrestling reporters out there with the kind of training, the kind of experience, and the kind of resources to handle a big, breaking, scandalous story like Speaking Out. It doesn't happen. There may be some here and there, but they're not doing that. A lot of people like Sean Ross Sapp, for example, are wearing a lot of hats. They have to do a million different things to keep their site afloat, to keep doing what they're trying to do. And then like big companies like big legacy media companies or whatever, they are not going to care about wrestling enough to investigate that kind of stuff in general. Mm-hmm. And so the result of Speaking Out was the wrestlers going on Twitter and making their accusations and speaking their truths and talking about that. And that's not a really great way for that information to come out.
Yeah.
Maybe for some people, maybe that's their preferred method. But when you're just like, here's a Twitter thread about this horrible thing that happened to me, and then you have the person saying and replying via Twitter thread saying, I didn't do any of this stuff, and here's why. That's not the best. That's not the best way for, I think, everything to be covered. We shouldn't just be basing a stuff on tweets. And if we had a more robust media environment, if we had if it was real sports and there was a similar kind of scandal, like I think it was the New York Mets. There was a big kind of sexual assault scandal going on in their front office.
Yep.
It's been going on for years, but the big story I think broke. I think there was a story a few years ago, and then it kind of came back like a year earlier this year. But basically, similar, really scary, harrowing, disgusting, sexual assault stories. But it came out through the media. It came out with people being interviewed by real reporters and being published, having these accusations published, having them verified, people getting police reports, all of this stuff to kind of show. That's how the accusations would be covered in a real media atmosphere. Because wrestling lacks this infrastructure and lacks a lot of professionalism, it's so much worse because we have way more, accusations where people are going to react. I mean, the accusations are just put out there on social media and everyone reacts the way that people on social media react, which is oftentimes not helpful to the situation. And I recommend anyone to read it. John Pollock wrote it. I think it came out last month. But it was a really interesting evaluation about, the wrestling media landscape and a failure of the wrestling media landscape, not having the kind of resources and people dedicated to that.
Yeah, I think the article is called Speaking Out or something to that effect. Just look it up. But David Bixenspan, he wrote a follow-up sort of response article to
that. Yes,
I
read that too.
Yeah, he's done some really good reporting himself, especially on the Drake Younger stuff. I think that's
Bix is Bix is the one guy who's kind of independently going out there and researching stuff and making a bunch of FOIA requests and doing what would be called real journalism. I don't always agree with Bix, but he's clearly someone that's doing a lot of work in treading the ground. But he's one of the only people, and he's basically the only one that's doing it kind of independently.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing too. He's an independent journalist, which is very difficult, I'm sure, for him to
Yeah.
really develop to dedicate some resources to this reporting because it takes a long time, and it's not exactly bringing in a lot of income as well. And so I'm sure like he's picks and chooses wherever stories he wants to focus on and to really deep dive into. But yeah, it's usually the independent reporters that are doing this stuff, other than like I remember Sports Illustrated, they had a big story about, the Dallas Mavericks, front office situation and all the controversies around there. I mean, that's, Sports Illustrated may be waning, but it's a pretty decent big organization rather than being independent, which is all of wrestling journalists are. They're independent journalists and they try to do their best to cover their stories.
Or they got a million other things to do.
Yes.
And again, what it ultimately comes down to is the public and the wrestling fan base has to be invested in and demand a higher standard for journalism. And I just don't see that happening. I see it sliding down even further, and people, there was, again, I bury Louis Dagnor again. He was on social media, saying like, I don't know why people are going to ask about Velveteen Dream at the Triple H's press conference, because he's not going to, or Drake Wirtz at Triple H's press conferences, because he's not going to answer those questions. So why even ask them? And it's like, bro, like you should, even if he says no comment, you should always ask them the hard questions. You shouldn't just say, oh, they're not going to answer, so I can't ask them. You have to ask people hard questions. I do it all, not to put myself over again, but I do it all the time. Even though I say, I know they're probably going to say no comment. Sometimes I'll even be like, I know that you're probably not going to answer this, but I have to ask you, do you think blah, 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 blah? And they'll be like, oh yeah, I can't answer that. You always just have to ask them that. Like, you can't not ask them that, because then, sometimes they will answer it, or you have to do at least a little bit of due diligence. And I feel like that's kind of the atmosphere that we're treading towards, is that like, oh, well, why would you guys ask that question? He's not going to answer. And it's like, well, you guys should be mad that he didn't answer the question, not mad at me for asking it, because it's real information that, is valuable for people to know.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it just, like you said, the wrestling fans, they don't want that. That's not what they desire in their content viewing. They just want this very, I guess, like you said, right? A Ryan Satin-esque, all everything's rainbows, everything's good, everything's happy. There's nothing wrong with wrestling. That's sort of the view they want to have, even though it's not the reality. There's a lot of messy stuff in wrestling, and they need to be asked. Like you said, you have to ask these questions. Even if you expect a no, you just have to ask it, because it's just routine. It's just a ritual that you have to do as a journalist. You have to do these things because if you don't, that presents a bad image for yourself, especially, it ruins your reputation if you don't even bother asking these questions. Because if you actually care about your reputation as a journalist, then, you have to ask these questions, or else, your reputation is shot.
Yeah, I mean, no one wants to. There are certain places for, like, it's more intricate than, sometimes we make it out to be. There are you do have to walk a fine line between not pissing off your sources so much that they never want to talk to you again. And you want to be, there's a way to approach things diplomatically. And the reality is, as a reporter, like we talked about, people maybe not always reporting on their, things that might make their sources look bad. The reality, as a reporter, you do have to have a lot of ethical considerations about what you're going to do and how you're going to present something in the most ethical and informative way possible. And also trying to be respectful to different people and different parties involved. And if you have personal relationships with these people, it becomes a little bit more difficult. And it's a challenge. And I think until you're really in journalism and when you're really in that environment and you're like, oh man, do I really want to do this? Or how do I handle this? Like, you really can't understand that. But as someone that is in that environment on a daily basis, it's a real challenge. But I think to be just dismissive about it and be like, oh, we shouldn't ask them these questions. And then for the fan base that should really be even if they're not interested, should be really encouraging every kind of question to be asked at these press conferences, to be like, oh, why are people just calling, these reporters are just trying to make Triple H look bad. Dave Meltzer's just trying to make Triple H look bad. And it's like, no, you should be encouraging all of these people to ask these questions, because ultimately we're going to have a better media atmosphere because of it. I think when people interview, like when people, a lot of times, well, if I'm watching a press conference and someone asks a really stupid question, I'll say, well, that was a really stupid question. But I would never begrudge them for asking it because, we want to encourage different kind of questions to be asked. And sometimes there's going to be questions where I'm like, that was a stupid question. But then the person gives a really interesting answer. I'm like, oh, okay. By them, maybe the question wasn't great, but the answer was. And it seems like very like it's weird, like very anti-progressive when it comes to media coverage in wrestling to just be like, we got to be respectful of Triple H kayfabing us, essentially, right? We got to be respectful for them protecting the business. We don't want to ask any too tough questions because we have to understand that they're protecting the business. And it's like, no. Ask these questions. Triple H wants to pretend that he's open to the media. He wants to have this little media call and, invite all these reporters from these publications, and he gets to wear a suit and he gets to talk about everything that's happening. If he wants to actually do all that stuff like that, reporters got to be allowed to ask all these questions.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just, for closing thought on that, I think fans should expect better of the wrestling media coverage and even of their favorite wrestling promotions as well. If you want them to be better, a part of it is media coverage as well to put pressure on them. I think that's a closing point for me.
Yeah, no, and that's definitely what the point is. I think the ultimate, point of all this is that a more robust media environment, a more open media environment, a environment that encourages people to ask questions, that encourages people to speak on the record about issues, is ultimately going to be a better wrestling environment. And I'm not just talking about, is it going to make the in-ring quality of wrestling inherently any better? Probably not. But it's going to make a big difference on the ethical side of wrestling. It can make a big difference on the standards that we hold wrestling companies to. I wish mainstream media, went after WWE for things like the Saudi Arabia deal, or I wish mainstream media went after WWE and AEW too for the independent contractor deal. Those are things that are going to benefit the industry. And there's a reason communication's really like the whole field of communication is a really important part of any functioning society, any functioning government. And if we continue down this road where the fan base doesn't really care about that communication and people are okay with not asking hard questions and people are okay with just everyone spouting their opinion without any real factual information to back it up, the industry is not going to get any better. And we're going to continue to be in a situation where wrestling is made fun of and wrestling is delegitimized, and mainstream media doesn't care about wrestling fans because they think we're all stupid. And sometimes, we give them reason to think that.
Yeah, for sure. And, I don't know if you have any other points, Jesse, but obviously, we'd love to hear from you. Put in the comments of what your thoughts on like wrestling media coverage and how it can be better. Your suggestions of how it can be better. Like you said, there's no stupid questions. There's always different responses that everyone can have to whatever way you think wrestling media coverage can be better. So obviously, always we appreciate any sort of feedback.
Yeah, I know. We love feedback on the show, and I'm really interested in hearing what other people's thoughts are on this. As a media professional, I put a lot of thought into this. It's something that as I've become more of spent more years in the news industry, I kind of realized that there's not a lot of people with my background that are in wrestling media, and what are some of the problems that can cause. And it's definitely something that I'm going to continue to put a lot of thought into because it's become something that's become kind of a pet project of mine. So we'll probably address it again sometime down the road, but appreciate everyone who's been listening this entire time and people who click on these videos when they're attached to stuff. Really appreciate it. Like I said, we're just kind of doing this as a fun aside for two guys who love wrestling. So we appreciate any support that we can get. And we'll talk to you guys in a few weeks. Thanks a lot.